And it's not because I'm such a great teacher. It's because marriage is such an important topic. Almost all of you will get married. The percentages among Americans is over 90% of people get married at some point. And it is one of the most, if not the single, most important decision that you'll ever make. It will do more than virtually any other decision to influence your happiness, your well-being, and the well-being of your spouse, the well-being of your children, if you have any children. So it's a huge, important decision that almost all of us make. And make for good reason. The research shows that married people on average are more happy than those that are not married, more healthy, more wealthy, have more flourishing. Again, in general, there are obviously exceptions, but in general, marriage is certainly a well-trod path to happiness and well-being. So in this course, what I do is I talk about what I wish I knew about marriage before I got married, right? When I was in college, when I was your age. What are the key insights, the key ethical understandings that would have really helped me a lot? And we don't have time today to go over all the 7 big myths about marriage. But what I'd like to do instead is to go a little bit more in depth about just 2 of them. And I'll start off with the big myth that marriage, or that cohabitation, is just like marriage. That is to say, living together as a romantic couple prior to marriage is just like marriage. And people basically have 2 different views about marriage, and both of these views lead to cohabitation. So the one view is this. I'll call it the low view of marriage. And the low view of marriage says, marriage doesn't matter. Right? It's just a piece of paper. I mean, what does it matter if you have a ring in your hand or you don't? Marriage really doesn't matter. What really matters is love. What really matters is fidelity. What really matters is having a good relationship with your partner. And whether you're married or not, totally indifferent. So I can find love, I can find stability, I can find everything you look for in a relationship in cohabitation just as much as I could if I got married. That's a low view of marriage. Now, sociologists of the family have done a great deal of research comparing cohabiting couples on the one hand with married couples on the other hand. And what they found is very significant. What they found is this. On average, when you compare these 2 groups of people, what you find is that among couples that are cohabiting, you find more strife, you find more disagreement, you find more infidelity, you find more violence, you find a higher likelihood of breaking up than you do when you compare it to married couples. Now you might say to me, well, yes, but I know married couples who have strife and disagreement and they got divorced and all hell broke loose, violence was terrible. That's true, that's true. But when you're talking about averages, you don't just look at this particular married couple and this particular cohabiting couple. You look at thousands and thousands and thousands of them, and you look for the trends. And so just as you can say, look, I know this guy, he never had 1 cigarette in his whole life, and he died of lung cancer. And I know this other guy, and he smoked 2 packs a day from the age 15 to age 95, and he died of something unrelated to smoking. And that very well may be true. But that does not show that smoking is irrelevant for the likelihood of bad health outcomes. So what they found basically is that cohabitation, in effect, is really not like marriage. Cohabiting couples, as I mentioned, have lower levels of sexual exclusivity. They also have lower levels of sexual satisfaction. That is to say, if you ask, on average, a married couple versus a cohabiting couple, are you happy with your sex life? It's much more likely that the married couple will say, yes, we are, than the cohabiting couple. So, cohabitation makes a big difference for the couples, but it also makes an even bigger difference for children. When couples live together, either in marriage or in cohabitation, it's highly likely that over time they're going to have children. And when you compare the well-being of those children over time, you find, again, these very remarkable differences. So if a child is raised by a married couple, that child is more likely to finish school, more likely to stay out of trouble with the law, more likely to have better physical health, more likely to have better mental health, is more likely to be flourishing in virtually every objective measure of flourishing that there is. Children do much better in terms of marriage. In fact, child abuse is incredibly common among cohabiting couples, particularly if the child is not their own shared biological child. So if you look at, for instance, rates of sexual abuse in family, it is true, unfortunately, that there are some, say, biological fathers who molest their own biological children. But that's extremely rare. extremely rare. The much more common situation is you have a cohabiting couple where you have the girlfriend's daughter getting molested by the living boyfriend, who's not the biological father. Much more common. So, if you were looking for lasting love, if you were looking for a sexually satisfying relationship, if you were looking for a relationship in which there's less violence and more likely of staying together, all that is much more likely to be found in marriage than cohabitation. So that's the low view of marriage. Let me contrast that with the high view of marriage. The high view of marriage is this view. Marriage really matters. Marriage is not just a piece of paper. I want my marriage to last forever. I don't want to get divorced. Marriage is extremely important to me. And some people who have the high view of marriage reason in the following way. Marriage is so important to me, and I so intently do not want to get divorced that I'm going to live with the person prior to marriage, and this is going to be a good way to test out and to see whether this person really is spouse material. And then after we live together for 2 years, then 2.5 years, whatever, I'll really be able to decide whether to get married to this person. And therefore, my likelihood of divorce is going to be way lower if we cohabit than if we don't cohabit and we just get married without ever living together. Right? So this is the high view of marriage. I really care about marriage. I really do not want to get divorced. Therefore, I'll cohabit in order to lower my likelihood of divorce. Well, they studied this as well. And what they found is this. Different studies have different percentages, but some studies find that couples that live together prior to marriage are about 50% more likely to divorce. Not less likely, more likely. Other studies found 80% more likely to divorce than couples that do not live together. And they also found that the longer a couple cohabits, the higher the likelihood of divorce. And again, this is kind of counterintuitive. But I had experienced something like this with a friend in my own life. I know this guy who lived with his girlfriend for 9 years. And then they got married. And then they got divorced within a year. And I was stupefied. I thought, how could you possibly get divorced so quickly? I mean, you've lived with her for 9 years. I mean, how could you possibly not know whatever, she didn't leave the toothpaste cap on or whatever it was? I mean, you must know her after 9 years, I think. But then later I learned that this is actually incredibly common. It's very common for couples. That research shows basically the longer a couple lives together, the more likely it is that they'll get divorced. And then another thing that increases likelihood of divorce is cohabiting with multiple people. What I mean is you cohabit with one person from, say, age 22 to 24, and then you break up. Then you cohabit with a different person from, say, 26 to 28, and then you break up. And then you cohabit with a third person from, say, 29, and then you get married at 32. Well, the likelihood of divorce for that kind of person is extremely high. So the more people you cohabit, the more likely, again, it is that you'll get divorced. Now, the people who have studied statistics and sociology and philosophy out there, you might have a question. Is this a correlation or is this a causation? In other words, is it the case that living together actually causes an increased likelihood of divorce, like say smoking cigarettes causes an increased likelihood of getting cancer? Or is it mere correlation? Like for instance, there's a correlation between wearing a leather jacket and getting into a motorcycle accident, right? Now, is it because anyone who wears a leather jacket can't drive a motorcycle and they're going to crash because the leather jacket's around? Well, no. It's just that the kind of people who wear leather biker jackets are the kind of people who drive motorcycles and therefore get into motorcycle accidents. There's no causal connection at all. It's merely correlation. Well, they looked at this also, and they found that basically correlation accounts for part of the effect. In other words, the kind of people who are more likely to get divorced are also the kind of people who are more likely to cohabit. But what they found is that that doesn't explain everything. They found that actually there's a causal link. That is to say that living together prior to marriage actually increases the likelihood of divorce. Now, how does that work? Well, there's a number of different theories, and I talk about them in my book. But I'll talk about just one theory. And that's called the sliding versus deciding theory. Okay? So everyone has different levels of kind of people they're interested in and different levels of things they're willing to do with things. So here's what I mean. If you're a single person, there's a certain standard a person would have to meet for you to be willing to go on one date with the person. Right? In other words, there's some people who say, yeah, I'll go on one date with you. no problem. And then some people say, well, I wouldn't even go on one date with this person, no way. And then you have a higher standard for somebody you're willing not just to go on one date with, but you're willing to call your boyfriend or girlfriend. And that's a more demanding standard, right? There's a number of people you go on one date with that you really wouldn't be willing to call your boyfriend or girlfriend. And then there's a still more demanding standard of somebody you'd be willing to not only call your boyfriend or girlfriend, but actually move in with them, right? That's a higher standard. And then a still higher standard would be somebody you'd be willing to commit to in marriage for life. That's the highest standard, right? So what happens in many cases of cohabitation is that people move in together. And when they move in together, they start accumulating things. So for instance, they move in together and the TV breaks. All right, well, you better get a new TV. All right, we'll split that. Put money together and buy a new TV. And then they get a cat, right? Okay, we get the cat. And then we get a dog too. Okay, we get a dog. And they start building a kind of life together, right? And the longer they stay together, the more of their life they build together. They get a new couch, they share a car, they share this, they share that. And basically what happens is it becomes more and more expensive, more and more costly to break off the relationship. Because if you decide to not go out with her, to move out, that means, okay, well, who gets a TV? Who gets a cat? Who gets a dog? What are we going to do about this car now? We've got all these things that are tying you together. So the cost of breaking off gets higher and higher. So what happens to many couples is they slide into marriage rather than initially deciding. In other words, after living together for 3, 4, 5 years, they look at each other and say, well, we might as well get married. We've got the car, we've got the couch, we've got the dog, we've got the cat, we've got all this stuff. Let's just get married. But they would have never married this person if they didn't have all these things that bound them together. If the cost of getting rid of the person were lower, they would choose to get rid of it. But the cost now of getting rid of the person is so high, wow, they go ahead and get married. And you can see how they'd be more likely to divorce because the partner is not as high quality as they would have wanted, and the relationship is not as high quality as they would have wanted. So they end up saying, oh, well, we're just going to get divorced, right, eventually. The other thing that I point out to my students, which I think is very important, especially for the women in the audience. Men, you can close your ears if you want. But women, this is about you. David Buss, in his book, The Evolution of Desire, pointed out that worldwide, when men are looking for a marriage partner, and when women are looking for a marriage partner, they have slightly different priorities in what they're looking for. Okay. So what is it worldwide, and this is on average, so there can be exceptions, but worldwide, if you look at most women, what are they looking for in a marriage partner? When they're thinking, this is going to be my husband, what kind of qualities do they want? Well, it turns out worldwide, in every culture that they've studied, that women value financial stability, ability to provide, prestige, etc., more than men do. Right? And again, this is worldwide, every culture, every religion. They found that men, when they're looking for a marriage partner, value youth and beauty more than women do. Right? And this helps explain, for instance, why in every culture the marriage age of men and women is on average different. So, for instance, in our culture right now, men get married on average around the age of 28. Women get married on average around the age of 26. Now, it used to be in the early 60s that people got married younger, but back then it was, women got married at 21 and men got married at 23. And in some cultures it's even later than it is in our culture. But in those cultures you find the same thing. Men get married, let's say 32, and women, when they get married on average, are 30. Right? And again, there are exceptions. My wife is older than I am, so there are obviously exceptions, but on average. So what does all this mean when you turn to cohabitation? Well, it turns out that 3 out of 4 cohabiting couples do not get married. Right? Most do not. So let's say you have 2 people, and we'll make them the same age just to make this more even. You have 2 25-year-olds that move in together, right? You've got Stacy and Tim, right? Moving together at 25. And they live together for, say, 7 years. And then after 7 years, they say, well, no, it's not going to work out. We're not going to get married, right? Now, what's happened over the course of that 7 years? Well, what's happened is this. Tim is likely to have moved forward in his career. He's more likely to be more eligible. He's more likely to be more wealthy, more advanced, more prestigious. In my own case, at 25, I was a graduate student making $10,000 a year, right? At 32, well, I was a professor. I almost had tenure. Wow, I was looking a lot better, right? So and this isn't true for every man, but on average, by and large, most people, men and women, are further ahead at 32 than 25. And what's happened on average for women? Well, on average, most women are younger at 25 than they were at 32. On average. There's some exceptions. No, of course, there's no exceptions, of course. And now you could say, well, yes, but some women are more beautiful at 32, 25. But on average, obviously, all women are younger at 25 than 32. But on average, they are viewed generally as more beautiful at 25 than 32. So what happens to Tim and Stacy when they're 32 and they break up and they've been cohabiting? Well, what happened basically is he has gained more of what most women are looking for in a marriage partner. And she has lost more of what most men are looking for in a marriage partner. So relative to where they began, she has lost and he has gained. So cohabitation is something that I think systematically works to the disadvantage of women who are looking to get married, who are in the marriage market. Now, you might say, all this sounds good, but look, if I don't cohabit with somebody, well, what do you want me to do? Just get married? And I don't think there's any single answer for that. Yes, of course, I think some people should not get married. Not get married at age 25, 35, 45, 85. Yes, of course. But if you find someone that you really love and really loves you, I think that some people have a misunderstanding about how old you have to be to lower your likelihood of marriage. In other words, likelihood of divorce, rather. In other words, it is true that people who get married very young are very, very likely to divorce. If you get married at 16, 17, 18, it's highly, highly likely you'll get divorced. But a mistake people make is they go to the other extreme. They say, well, okay, so if getting married at 16 is a bad idea, I better wait till I'm 36 or 38 or 42, and then I'll get married. Well, you can wait as long as you like, but there's no difference for men in the likelihood of getting divorced if you get married at 22 or at 28. No difference at all. Not 1%. And for women, there's almost no difference. The difference is only 2% per year, so almost no difference. So the bottom line is this: if you find someone you really love in your, college graduate age, 22, 23, 24, there's no reason not to get married for them, at least in terms of likelihood of getting divorced. No difference. Another way to put the same point is this: when they did research on which couples are the happiest on average, right? What they found might surprise you. They found the couples that are happiest on average are the couples that got married relatively young. Again, not young like 17, but relatively young. They got married between the ages of 22 and 25. Those are, on average, the most happy couples. Now, why is that? I'm not exactly sure, but I have a theory. My theory is the draft pick theory. Right? I don't know if you guys follow the NFL or baseball or whatever, but if you follow the NFL, every year there's a draft, and every year in the draft, who gets chosen first, second, third, fourth? The best college football players in the country, at least as far as they can tell. Right? The Heisman Trophy winner, the quarterback on the national championship team, the running back who ran 3,000 yards, the absolute best people. And I think the same thing's true not just in the NFL draft, but in the marriage market. If you have a young man who's outstanding, hardworking, attractive, wonderful, excellent, don't you think a lot of people will think that too? And if you find a woman who's wonderful, excellent, beautiful, everything you'd want in a wife, chances are lots of people will think she's something too. So if those kind of people marry each other, right, they're taken off the, out of the market, as it were. Right? They're drafted. They're off, playing for the Seahawks or the Patriots or whatever. But if you wait, it can be a very big cost. Right? If you wait, I'm married, but I have friends my age that aren't married. If you wait till you're 45 and you start looking around for people to get married, it's highly likely, right, that a lot of the people that you're going to encounter as potential mates are going to be people that have some difficulties. Right? They're on their third marriage. They've got a drug problem. They've got this or that. Now, obviously, there's great people get married today. I'm not trying to say everything, but I'm saying the pool of eligible people shrinks as you get older. Right? Because a lot of the eligible people who want to get married did get married by the time you're mid-30s, 40, whatever. So again, there's no right age to get married. Right? So everyone should get married at 22, 23, 24. No. But I just want to encourage you not to make choices based on things that aren't true. Like, I don't want to get divorced, therefore I don't want to get married young, therefore I better get married at 28, 32, whatever. You can do that if you want, but you don't have to. There's no, in terms of evidence, there's no reason to delay marriage that long. You can have an equal likelihood of staying married, get married relatively young, 22, 28. That's the first myth. Cohabitation is equal to marriage. Second myth is this: children are irrelevant to marriage. Right? I'll call this the myth of the child as a vampire. Right? When I was an undergraduate, I got a phone call that totally changed my life. And the phone call just had two words that are really relevant for how it changed my life. I got a phone call, and the two words I heard were, "I'm pregnant." I was completely stunned. I knew I could be a father, and at the same time I knew I couldn't be a father. So I told my roommate laughingly, "Oh, Jennifer tells me she's pregnant." And I was laughing kind of in this hysterical laughter. He thought I was joking. I was like, no, I'm totally serious. And he started crying. Well, I didn't cry, but what I did is I got out my running shoes and I went out into the cold Boston night and I ran for probably 8 or 10 miles, pretty much as hard as I could. And I yelled at the sky, "Oh, how could this happen to me? This is, catastrophe." And I really thought of a child a little bit like a little vampire, right? Kind of sucking the life out of your dreams. I thought I'd be some kind of duty-deadened adult, sort of a, like you see in vampire movies. They're kind of alive, but they're kind of undead or whatever. They're kind of in this middle state. Now, you can't run away from your problems forever. So then I shifted into second reaction. And the second reaction was pouting, right? So I went to the Lamaze kind of birth classes or whatever, and I pouted through that. And I pouted through my summer job teaching, and I just was grumpy, and I was really not in the best attitude. Anyway, so then comes the time for the birth. So I'm in there with Jennifer, and she's going to give birth. And then all of a sudden, they had this thing called a fetal heart monitor, which basically means they put a little electrode thing on the baby's skull, and they can tell the baby's pulse from that. And I was in there, as she, was in labor and stuff, and suddenly that thing started to go down. Right, it went down a bit, and then all of a sudden it like flatlined, and the alarms went off. And all of a sudden, everybody rushed into the room with Jennifer and me, and the doctors were there, and the nurses, and they were shouting orders, and they said something about prepping for C-section, and somebody took me aside and kind of put on a surgical garb kind of thing, and they rushed her into the emergency room to do the C-section. And they got the knife out, and they were just ready to cut her open and deliver the baby and save the baby's life before it died. And I remember thinking, only at that moment did I really realize, how important this woman and this child really were to me. I mean, how incredibly meaningful and how devastating I would be if anything happened to either one of them. So, fortunately, just before they were to cut into Jennifer, the baby's pulse came back up, and then within 5 minutes, my daughter Elizabeth was born. And when she came out, it was such a revelation to me, a real epiphany. It really it turned into the best day of my whole life. There's nothing like seeing your child being born and carrying your child out of that little room and showing your parents. And it really is quite amazing. And I guess what I didn't realize is I didn't realize what children give to parents. Right? We think a lot about what parents give to children, life and nurturing, and models, and all the millions of things. But we don't think about what children give to parents. And I think children really do give things to parents. I'm not just thinking about ties or Mother's Day cards or flowers. I'm thinking about things that are really, really substantial. So sometimes people overestimate it. They just think of the negative. So one time I asked rhetorically to talk, well, what do children give to parents? And somebody raised his hand. And I thought to myself, well, I wasn't really asking a question, but okay. And he said, gray hair. And somebody called out, yeah, children give to parents ulcers, empty bank accounts, no respect. Okay, that's sort of true, but I think there's actually a deep truth to it. So first, what I want to say is that children help parents to realize the goal of a life of love. I don't know if any of you have ever read Plato's Symposium. It's a wonderful work about the nature of erotic love. What is being in love? What does that really mean to say you're in love with whoever? Well, when you're in love, what Aristophanes thought, at least in Plato's Symposium, is that being in love is desiring to have the deepest union possible you can with the one you love. Right? People who are in love want to spend their time together. Eat lunch together, make love together, talk about things together. They just want to spend all the time together because that's what it is to be in love. You want to be unified with one another. But if you think about it, when you have a child with someone, you are, in fact, unified with that person. That is, a part of you and a part of that person is exactly what made this baby. In fact, all of us are walking testaments to the union, at least temporarily, of our mother and our father. But I think the unity goes beyond just a kind of physical DNA unity. The unity includes, I would say, a kind of unity that comes about through, not always sadly, but usually, a unity of affection. So the mother and father are unified in loving their child. A unity of will. The mother and father work together to promote that child's well-being. A unity of shared activity, right? That they run a household and they raise the kid together. And that's why having children is something that actually decreases your likelihood of divorce. It makes it much less likely that you'll get divorced. In fact, what they found is that, this is a United Nations study of 45 societies, they found this, that 39% of divorces occur where the couple has no children, 26% when there's just one child, 19% when there are two children, and less than 3% likely to divorce when there are 4 or more children. This is something Aristotle thought, that children are kind of glue that hold a couple together, that really help a couple to weather difficult times. And all marriages have ups and downs. I mean, marriage is a little bit like health. I mean, all of us go through health problems. You get a minor health problem, you get sinus infection, sometimes you have major health problems. You have appendicitis, you get cancer. That's part of the human condition. We have health problems. And all marriages have ups and downs. All couples have irreconcilable differences. That's okay, that's just part of the human condition. Like health problems, they're a challenge to deal with, but there's no reason to give up on health, or a reason to give up on marriage. Secondly, I think children help strengthen what Aristotle called a friendship of virtue. That is, children help a couple to strengthen or create a friendship of virtue. What do I mean? Well, for Aristotle, friendship consisted in part in having mutual goodwill, in making the same choices, and in sharing one's friends' distresses and enjoyments. So when you have children, though, you have all these things. You have mutual goodwill, because when you have a child with someone, you have an extra reason to love them. So I have an extra reason to love my wife, Jennifer, because we have these children together. She's not just my wife, she's also the mother of my children. You have making the same choices. When you have children, you have a built-in shared activity. That is raising your children to maturity. And then sharing in your friends' distresses and enjoyment. This, too, is something, a reason that children strengthen a marriage. So when a married couple has a child together, they will share together the ups and downs of having a child. So my wife Jennifer and I, we have a son who's really good at sports. So he's in college now, but when he was in high school, we used to love to go to his football games. And, you know, he'd make an interception, and we'd cheer, we'd be so happy, we'd be, you know, overwhelmed with joy together, right? And the same thing's true with sharing things that are distressing, right? We have another child who has serious learning disabilities. And so, you know, she works really hard, studies for her tests, and then, you know, even though she studied 2 hours a day for the last 5 days, gets a test back, you know, D, C minus, F sometimes. And we're distressed together, we're upset together, but we're together. And that's part of friendship, is when you have a real friend, your emotional life is synced up with your friend. You care about their emotions, they care about yours, and your emotional life is kind of a unity. And for Aristotle, the best kind of friendship was a friendship of virtue. A friendship of virtue is one that he thinks that both people have these excellences of character called virtue. And Aristotle thought the way you get excellent in terms of character is by repeated activity. If you want to be patient, you've got to repeatedly do acts of patience. If you want to be a generous person, that person, you have to repeatedly do generous things. If you want to be a just person, you have to repeatedly do acts of justice. But if you think about it, children are a built-in school that helps inculcate virtue. Any halfway decent parent does innumerable kind, patient, generous things for their children, especially when they're young. And when they do that, they're building up in themselves more and more of this habit of excellence, this habit of virtue. They're deepening, in other words, or founding in Aristotelian friendship of virtue. Finally, I want to say a word about, on a theological note. I think not only do children help parents realize the role of erotic love, not only do children help parents to realize and deepen a friendship, but also children help their parents get to heaven. I mentioned that someone in this wiseacre in the previous talk said, yeah, children help you get to heaven because you've got to go through hell to get to heaven. No, that's not it. The first way I think children help parents get to heaven is this. And I think parents can understand something about God's love better when they have children. And the reason is this. When you're a father or mother, if you're halfway decent, you love your child intensely. You love your child passionately. You love your child with your whole heart. And when you love someone that much, I think it gives a person some sense, at least, of God, the Father's love for us. Right? If you become a parent, you can understand how a divine parent loves. And when you understand how much God loves you, this helps you to love God in return. Jesus said that if you wish to enter into life, that is, if you wish to go to heaven, you need to keep the commandments. And one of the most important commandments is the fourth commandment. The fourth commandment is honor your father and mother. And this, too, I think, is facilitated by having children. And the reason is this, that when you don't have children, it's easy to be haughty towards your own parents. And to think, oh, you made this mistake, you made that mistake, I can't believe you did this, I remember this horrible thing. But when you have children, you realize very quickly that it is impossible, not just hard, it's impossible to be a perfect mother or a perfect father. No one does it. I made a horrible mistake the very first day my newborn daughter Elizabeth came home from the hospital. I was emptying out the car, and babies come with a bunch of gear. You probably know, you've got the diaper bag and the little seat and the car seat and all this stuff. So I'm emptying all this stuff. So I'm emptying all this stuff, and a big pile of stuff. Finally, I get Elizabeth out. Okay, I put her on top of this pile. And then I go to get the last little thing. Okay, that's a mistake. You do not want to do that. If you have kids, don't put the newborn on top of the pile. She fell off the pile, onto the ground, cried out. She was fine, but it was horrible. I didn't even get her in the house before it was horrible. This is not good. But the mistakes that parents inevitably make, and the hardship, the difficulty, the challenge of being a parent, I think makes you much more loving, kind, and willing to honor your own parents. In fact, sometimes it's only when you are raising a child that you can really even understand how challenging and difficult it was for your own parents to raise you. And this gives rise, I think, quite naturally to honoring them. Children also help us to obey the first commandment. The first commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart. And as little children, we know we're not God. Right? I mean, when you were a 5-year-old, your parents decided when you got up, when you went to bed, what color shirt you wore, what you ate for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Your whole life is dominated when you're a little kid by your parents. It's very obvious to you, in a visceral sense, you're not God. But as you go into adulthood, it becomes easier to live in the illusion that pretty much the universe is yours to define. Right? That everything really is up to you. I mean, you decided, I'm guessing, what you wore today. You decided what you ate for breakfast. You decided when you got up, you decided everything, I'm guessing. And when you have children, though, that illusion of self-sufficiency, that you're in charge of everything, is easily shattered. And it's easily shattered because we don't choose our children's looks, our children's intelligence, whether our children are shy or not shy, whether our children are going to head off to Villanova University or have serious learning disabilities. We don't choose normally whether it's even a boy or a girl. If we're a good parent, we accept, we love whatever child comes to us. And even if we did choose our child to be magistrate, well, what about genetic selection or something? You know, imagine somebody who created a designer baby. I want, a 6-foot-tall, 6'3" basketball genius. I mean, you can imagine somebody. But even then, you don't really control your children, because even if you could control all those other things, you're not able to control your children. Every parent has stories of children, embarrassing them and causing trouble for them. One of the stories that I mentioned in the book is about one of my other children who we were at the Jesuit dining hall at Loyola-Marymount, right? All the Jesuits are eating their lunch. And I got invited there, and I got to bring my wife and a couple of my sons. And we're eating dinner, or lunch rather, and my son, George, was just learning to get potty trained. He was, I don't know, 3 or something. And he says to me, well, Dad, I have to go to the bathroom. Great, please go. And I gave him a big lecture beforehand about, be very polite, manners, please and thank you, use the napkin, all that. So anyway, so we leave the table, and he grabs his little hand, grabs that finger, and I walk him over across all the way down the hall to the door of the bathroom. And we get there, and he says, oh, Dad, I don't have to go anymore. Okay. Grab his little hand again, and walk him all the way back. And as I'm walking back, I notice something on the ground. And there's little, looks like marbles or something, little brown kind of pellets all the way back through. Yeah, he left a trail of poop all the way through the priest's dining hall. Okay. That was not ideal. That was not my finest parenting hour. We got out of there really fast. Thank you, Father, for lunch. We've got to go. Look at the time. Anyway, it was bad. But every parent has stories like that, where their invincibility, or their seeming invincibility, was undermined greatly by their kids. But this is good. This is good, because it's good not to live in the illusion of ultimate self-sufficiency, defined in the universe, I'm ultimately in charge of everything. And children have a way of puncturing those sorts of illusions on a regular basis. Finally, Jesus said that people are going to be judged ultimately on the basis of their love, and not just the kind of warm feeling, but their love is expressed in action. He put it that at the last judgment, there'll be two groups of people, those who are going to heaven and those not going to heaven. And those going to heaven, he'll say, I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was naked and you clothed me. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. To those people, he says, come into my Father's kingdom. And I remember hearing that passage and thinking about that passage when I was a child. And I looked around the church and I thought, this is really not good news, because everybody here is going to hell. I mean, who does any of these things? Mother Teresa, maybe a few sisters, whatever, missionaries. No one does this stuff. We're all doomed, I thought. But when I got older, I thought, every good mother and every good father does all those things. When their child's hungry, they give the child something to eat. When the child's thirsty, they give the child something to drink. When the child's naked, after the bath or whatever, they clothe the child. And talk about welcoming a stranger. Every child, whether through birth or through adoption, every child comes into the family as a stranger. Right? You know what that child's going to be like, what their personality is going to be. But again, if you're a loving, good parent, you accept the child anyway. So maybe at the final judgment, the good Lord will see many of you who are good parents, who love their children, who gave their children what they needed, who tried to give their children even more than what they needed, who tried to help their children really flourish. And on that basis, we'll be welcomed into the kingdom of God. So in conclusion, the second big myth is that children are irrelevant to marriage. I think that's false. I think children contribute very greatly to the flourishing of their parents. They help their parents to realize the goal of their life, to be united together. They help their parents to strengthen or establish a friendship of virtue. And I think the children help their parents get together. Thank you very much. All right, so now for the best part of the time. Any questions? Yes?
So you talked about your sliding versus deciding theory. Do you think that can also apply to having children as well? Because maybe that's why like you would divorce, it's low with people without children?
Yeah, the likelihood of divorce rate is lower among people who do have children. The question of whether children are better cared for, or whether marriages flourish more if they're deliberately chosen rather than, say, just people who are open to life and have children. I didn't know any empirical evidence about the question. I just don't know if there's any, there might be studies, but I'm not aware of them, that show that children are better off if they're planned beforehand, or not as well off if they're planned beforehand, or couples are better off if they're planned, or not as well. I just know no evidence either way on that score. One thing that's sort of interesting, I think, though, is it is true that children who are unplanned are deeply loved by their parents, even though they weren't planned. So one interesting study followed people who had requested abortion but weren't able to get one for some reason, right? And what they found basically is that if you followed up with them, 5 years later or whatever, the majority of them didn't even recall ever wanting to have an abortion and were delighted, overjoyed at having their child. So I think that built into nature, there is, as you might expect, a kind of instinct for parents to love their children. I think it's particularly strong in women, but I think it's also something that is in men. I think that actually you'd be a little bit, there'd be something wrong with you, I think, really, if you have a child and raising this child and then you just indifferent to its well-being. I mean, I think that would show kind of really kind of pathology. But whether the child's planned, quote unquote, or not, I'm not aware of any evidence on either side of that kind of question. Yes?
Is there like a stat on whether somebody's spiritual relationship is their fallen relationship? You know what I mean? Like the chances that your first relationship is going to marriage, or is
yeah, there's some. Yes. So, in terms of likelihood of a marriage being happy and lasting, basically the research points to the idea that it's a good idea to limit the number of sexual partners. So, basically, people who have a bunch of sexual partners, they on average end up getting divorced more often, being less satisfied in their relationship, and having more serious problems. So in general, that points to the idea of it's not a good idea to be promiscuous if you want a happy, lasting marriage. It's not going to contribute. Yes?
Could you briefly mention what you think the other myths are?
Sure, yeah. This is embarrassing. I should have this memorized. I wrote the book, but I'm just going to read them. Otherwise, no, it's ridiculous. Otherwise, I'm going to go okay, myth number 4, anyway, so here they are. First is love is simple. So basically, I think it's really important to differentiate different kinds of love. So erotic love is a distinct thing from, say, the love of friendship, philia, and that's a distinct thing from the love of storge, kind of affection. All loves, though, are alike in this sense. All loves involve 3 elements. They involve goodwill for the other person. They involve appreciating the other person in some dimension. And they all involve some kind of unity with the other person. So friends who are academic friends might find unity through scholarly discussions and reading each other's papers. If you have a friend who plays tennis, maybe we're friends through playing tennis. You can base the friendship on all kinds, or the love on all kinds of different kinds of unity. What makes erotic love distinctive is that erotic love is about wanting a bodily unity. That is to say, you don't want to be united just in terms of playing tennis or just in terms of reading scholarly papers. You want to be united in a bodily, physical way. And that's what's distinctive about erotic love as opposed to mere friendship or other kinds of parental love, say. Second big myth is that marriage is a 50-50 contract. If you think about the marriage vow, the traditional marriage vow, it goes like this. I, Christopher, take you, Jennifer, to be my wife. In good times and in bad, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. I'll love you and honor you all the days of my life. Now that vow, at least if you say that vow, you are not making a mere contract with the person. You're not exchanging goods and services for a limited duration. You are making a covenant with that person. That is to say, you're giving not just things to them, goods and services, you're giving yourself to them as spouse. And in giving yourself, you're not just giving yourself right now for the next 2 years. You're giving yourself now and into the future. Because yourself, as long as your life will perdure into the future. So marriage is about a covenant of unconditional love. And if you look at that marriage vow, the marriage vow is unconditional. It doesn't say, I'll love you as long as you meet these conditions. I'll love you as long as you're young and beautiful, or as long as you're rich. I'll love you if you don't do this. I'll love you if you do that. It says, I will love you. It creates a family bond. And so in that respect, it's similar to having a child. With my son or my daughter, my loving them, my relationship to them as father and child, does not depend at all on what they do. So if I have a horrible daughter who gives me the middle finger, who sets fire to the house, who is a drug addict, who's going crazy, well, that's really too bad, but she's still my daughter. And if I'm a horrible father, if I'm absent, if I'm doing terrible things, that's horrible, but I'm still her father. So a father-child relationship is about unconditional love. It's a family bond. And in a covenant marriage, that's what you're making with your spouse. So we live in a free country. You do not have to get married at all, and obviously you can choose not to get into a covenant marriage. But I think it's important to have very clear in one's mind the difference between a mere contract marriage and a covenant marriage. So if you want unconditional love, if you want to create a family bond, well then you want a covenant marriage. If you want conditional love, I'll love you under these conditions and not that conditions, well then you can go for a contract marriage. But I think we're in a free country, but I think our choices should be informed by these two different conceptions of what marriage is. The fourth one I talked about, cohabitation, is just like marriage. The fifth one is premarital sex is no big deal. I think that also is a myth. And part of the reason it's a myth is that premarital sex, not always, but often leads to premarital pregnancy. Now, you might say, well, no, it doesn't. Look at it. Yeah, a man and a woman, two conscients, making love, she's on the pill. 99% effective. No problem. No, actually, there is a problem. There's a thing called cumulative probability. Cumulative probability is the probability of an event happening not just in one instance, but in an instance over time. So think about, say, if you had a gun and you had one bullet and you had 99 empty barrels. Now, if you fired that once, there's no problem, right? I mean, you've got a 99% chance of it not going off. But if you keep firing it, eventually it will go off. And the same thing's true with even contraception, which is, again, if used properly, which it often isn't, but if used properly, 99% effective. That 1% probability, taken over the course of 10 years, leads to a 70% likelihood of pregnancy. 70%. So in other words, if someone is on the pill, yes, it's highly likely in this particular month they'll get pregnant, but the likelihood that they will get pregnant over the course of time is overwhelmingly high. Now, if there's a pregnancy outside of marriage, what can you do about it? Well, there are not too many options. The options are very limited. You could get an abortion. Right? You could have a baby and be a single parent. You could place a child for adoption. You could get married. Right? I think those are the only options you can. Maybe I missed one. But I think that's it. But the trouble is all these options, to a greater or lesser degree, I think, at least endanger the well-being of the child. So this lecture is not about abortion, but I think there's very good reasons to think that abortion not just endangers the well-being of the child, but destroys the child's well-being. If you look at single parenthood, there are excellent single parents. My wife was raised by just her mother. Did a good job. But she will be the first one to say that that is not an ideal situation for a child. And there's lots of evidence that show that children in general do much better with two married parents than they do with just one parent. What about cohabitation? That was the option for cohabitation. Well, we already talked about how that's detrimental on average to children. And then what about adoption? Well, adoption, I think, is the best option in many situations. I myself am adopted and benefited greatly from the choice that my birth mother made. Incredibly grateful to her for doing that. But I think we have to recognize that adoption is making the best out of an imperfect and difficult situation. And again, my biological mother would be the first one to tell you that. It's very, very hard to nurture a life in utero and then at the end place the child for adoption. Very, very hard. So in fact what happens, unfortunately, is that most crisis pregnancies like that end up in the abortion column. And then finally, what about shotgun marriage? Well, that can be the best option under some circumstances. So for instance, let's say you had a couple that really loved each other, they were already planning on getting married, they're just moving up the wedding date. Okay, that seems fine. That's probably not going to have big problems. But even for that couple, a decision as important, momentous as marriage is best not made under the kind of pressure situation of a pregnancy. That's not the ideal circumstance when they can, one of the most significant decisions of their whole life. So again, what happens is that many people who lack the courage either to place a child for adoption or get married end up getting an abortion. So I think all these options to a greater or lesser degree endanger the well-being of the child. And a just person, I think, does not endanger the well-being of others without a serious reason. And for that reason, I think having sex outside of marriage is something a just person avoids doing, because it's endangering the well-being of the child who can conceive. The sixth one I talked about already, that children are irrelevant to marriage. I think children are very good. And the last one is all reproductive choices are equal. And in that In that section of the book, I talked about in vitro fertilization and other reproductive choices. So anyway, that's probably too long, but that's this brief summary.
Would you say opposites attract in terms of like personalities? Like my mom is, talking to a tree all day, and my dad, is like gentlemen all day. So
Yeah.
Where does that come from?
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. So all couples have differences, and all couples have irreconcilable differences, whether it's about politics, or where to live, or religion, or whatever. On the other hand, I think it's very wise to minimize those in the person you marry. In other words, I think it'd be really foolish to get married to somebody who you had everything as much as possible different from the person. I think if you have a commonality, that can be a huge plus. In particular, religion is very important. So one thing you can do to lower greatly your likelihood of getting divorced is, for instance, if you're Catholic, to marry another Catholic. Or if you're Jewish, marry another Jewish person. Or if you're Episcopalian, marry another Episcopalian. Why? Well, because what they found is that when a couple practices a faith together, that, again, greatly lowers the likelihood of divorce. In particular, if it's not just the woman doing it, but it's the couple together. The man is involved too. So that's one thing you can do. So that's the kind of thing. Now, are there marriages, good marriages, great marriages, where they differ on religion? Yeah, there are, certainly. But I would give you very strong advice that you would really be wise to minimize those differences. Because a lot of times people, before they get married, think, oh, I'll get married, and I'm Catholic, and this person's whatever, Muslim, or whatever. And it doesn't matter. I'm not really practicing my faith, and they're not even. But very often happens, you have a child, and all of a sudden you think, oh my gosh, what do I want for this child? I want the best for this child. I want a deep life for this child. I want this child to have a spiritual life. I want to have a relationship with God. Many, many, many people, even if they're not super practicing their faith when they're in college, say, come back to their faith, especially when they have a child. Now, if you have faith together, this is going to be a wonderful source of unity. You're delighted together when the child is baptized. You're overjoyed together when the child gets the first Holy Communion. And you're all together. And this is a real bond. And I found in my marriage, it has been a huge, huge help. So, like all couples, my wife and I have irreconcilable differences. And we disagree about sometimes very serious things, huge things. But at least the ultimate things, the biggest things of all, we do have in common. So our differences are not about those things. And that is actually a shared basis for making all the other decisions you're going to have to make. So I don't think it's necessary. Again, there are wonderful people, great marriages where they don't share that. But I think it's very wise to take that into account and to really seek that out. I think it's very wise. Yes?
I was wondering, you mentioned the covenant versus contracts, but also kind of related to that is a question regarding resiliency of marriage through and after adultery by one, or I guess possibly both, spouses. So how strong marriages can be if they continue, and how ways of thinking of marriage can survive that kind of, I guess I'll call it trauma.
Yeah. Well, marriages definitely can survive that kind of trauma. I mean, it is a trauma. It's like a heart attack. But people do survive heart attacks. Many people do. They live for years and years and they get over it. But it's a huge trauma. Whether the trauma is adultery or some lesser sort of trauma, all marriages are going to have trials and difficulties. And that's why I think forgiveness is so absolutely crucial for marriage. Because your husband or your wife is, and I guarantee you that, you bet you $1,000, is at some point really going to make you angry. Is really going to hurt your feelings. Is really going to make you think, why the hell did I marry that person? I can't believe it. That's going to happen. Now, if you forgive, if you have that in your arsenal, as it were, well, yes, it'll be painful, and you may always remember it to the day you die. But if you forgive, you have the ability to not hold it over the person's head, to really let go of those feelings of resentment, that resentment because of that word, retasting, as it were, where you call it in your mind and your stomach gets in the knot, etc. So forgiveness is absolutely central. And an interesting thing about forgiveness is actually, when people think about being hurt, people tend to, whether the thing is really big or really small, tend to think of it basically as similar. What I mean is, if you ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, how hurt were you by the adultery, by the mean word, by the whatever? People generally if something, they generally think it's like an 8, right? And again, this is even for murder. Like people who have a child killed, you think, well, that must be a 10. No, they generally think, 8.3. Your boss was a total jerk to you. Well, 8.3, 2. So people, no, really, they tend to really, however, it's not about the objective harm as much as that kind of felt harm. But in any case, even people who have had, which I take to be probably the worst sort of evil inflicted on having their children murdered, even those people can and do forgive their murderers. And so it's possible also in marriage, even for very serious things. Good, other questions? Yes.
I've been hearing about this theory that's coming to light more recently about how compatibility is having more of a weight in successful marriages than necessarily love. I'm not sure if you know that. Can you just touch?
Yeah. So one way of putting, I think what you're talking about is, there's research that shows that the heart of healthy, good marriages is friendship. So the husband and wife are really friends. They really share activity. They respect each other. They work together. All the things that we talked about earlier in terms of marriage, and friendship. That is much more stable than, say, raw animal passion, right? In other words, I think it's very rare for a couple on, the 50th anniversary to rip each other's clothes off in the parking lot and start, having sex in the car or something. It probably happens, but probably not, not super common, right? Whereas if you are, you're both 22 or something, that's going to be more likely. So if you based your marriage on, oh my gosh, she is so hot, she's a supermodel, oh my gosh, she is so hot, he's the most gorgeous guy in the world, and that really was all it was based on, that would be what Aristotle would call a marital friendship of pleasure. And those sorts of friendships, he thinks, those sorts of relationships where it's just raw animal passion or whatever, tend not to last very long at all. Right? They just don't work. And we have all kinds of evidence for that. You think about, say, the beautiful people, the most beautiful celebrities, Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston or something. Those are two attractive individuals, but that isn't guaranteed that they're going to have a good marriage or they end up getting divorced. So I think a wise person, obviously you want to be attracted to the person you're getting married to, but you also, it's necessary, you really should have this kind of deep friendship. That is really the heart and soul that will be sustaining for 50 years. Whereas, she's so incredibly hot, he's so incredibly hot. That's, again, you're not going to be like that 30, 40, 50 years down the road. Most likely. Maybe you'll be the happy exception, but probably. Yes?
I have a question about a contrast you made before between contractual and covenantal marriage. Where you said it's a free country, you can do the one or do the other. I'm wondering though whether that creates a picture where covenantal marriage comes to seem like a special form of contract. So the two people sort of agree by mutual understanding that the terms under which they're getting married involve a kind of unconditional commitment, and that's where the contrast is. But I'm wondering whether that might not be part of the problem, because there's still the picture that you are as two individual wills set in the terms of the relationship, and that seems quite different from an understanding of covenantal marriage where the idea might be, here's this institution, you can either join or not join, but the terms aren't yours to sort of configure to your personal preferences.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point, I think. I'd say, okay, so what distinguishes a covenant marriage from a contract marriage? One of the things was unconditional love. Another one of them was having a family bond. So let me talk about family bonds for a second. Most family bonds are created through biology. Right? So my brother or sister or my children are my brother or sister and children solely because of biology. Right? But there are other family bonds that are created through choice. So adoption. I mentioned earlier I'm adopted. And my relationship with my parents is not a biological relationship, but it was a relationship created because they chose me from St. Anne's Children's Home, and that's what started the relationship. But that relationship, I think, is just as real and just as permanent and just as unbreakable as a relationship with biological children. Like I can't unmake them my parents. They can't unmake me their child. And I think in a covenant marriage, at least, that's what you're getting into. And I do like your idea of something that you're entering into. So in the Catholic Church, at least, there's only one form of marriage that's available. Right? There is no contract marriage in the Catholic Church. If you went to the priest and say, well, I want to get married to this person, and we're going to try it out for 3 or 4 years, and then we'll maybe reevaluate. We'll re-up it for another 3 or 4 years. We'll see. The priest, I hope, would say, well, I'm glad you have this relationship, but what we do here is we do unconditional love. So if you want a conditional love that's based on 3 or 4 years, it's a free country. You obviously can do that. But what we are offering in this institution is this kind of thing. But I do think it's possible for someone who is not Catholic or not religious at all to freely choose to bind themselves in an irrevocable way. And they do this all the time through parenting. There's some people who, atheists, whatever, they deliberately choose, either through adoption or through biology, to create a child. And when they do that, they create this kind of irrevocable, permanent bond with this other person. And so I think in marriage, in covenant marriage, even if you're an atheist, you could do that. You could say, look, this is not a contract. I mean, it might be a contract that says if you sign papers, but what we're entering here is no longer subject to either one of us canceling it. This is absolutely, again, irrevocable. Now, it helps if you have an institution to support that, a community to support that, but it seems to me in principle, you can have two people like Desirado that enter into that kind of union together.
It used to be, it seems, that society offered a lot of buttresses to what you're talking about, some codified in law, like divorce law, and then certainly social.
Right.
In the absence of so many of those, and in presence of such a corrosive culture for that kind of, in which people would regard that kind of commitment that you're talking about as being not simply impractical, but dehumanizing and silly. What kind of societal changes need to happen in order to support that view of marriage, which, by and large, you presented, it's not based on revelation, but it's based on common sense and on practicalities and across the board.
That's a great question. I think there's so much work to be done. Like, one of the really sad things, I think, is how marriage is often portrayed in movies, on TV. And it's really sad, but very often, for instance, they portray just the problems. And there's a reason for that drama needs to be dramatic. If you have problems, it's not going to be much of a show if you just have people politely, would you pass the tea? Oh, yes. Everything's hunky-dory. So you got to have adultery, you've got to have all these problems. So I understand there's a dramatic imperative, but the trouble is people tend to glamorize in the media often things that are very, very harmful, and I think that's really too bad. But the idea, I think, of marriage being dehumanizing, I think that idea presupposes something that I would question, and that's this. I think that love is not dehumanizing, I think love is humanizing. I think that love of God, love of neighbor, love of your family, love of your spouse makes you more human, more distinctively specific as a human being, not less. And so freedom to be happy, it seems to me, is an essential sort of thing. And I don't think we can really ultimately be happy outside of love. Now, it doesn't have to be a spousal love. It could be love of a religious community, it could be love of God, it could be love of neighbor. There's lots of ways to love. But one way, a very effective way, I think, is love in marriage. Think about a resolution, like say it's New Year's, and say, I want to get in better shape. Now, if you just say, I want to get in better shape, and you have no plan, you have no concrete way of doing this, the likelihood of you getting in better shape is almost zero. Contrast that when somebody says, I want to get in better shape. What I'm going to do is every morning at 8 o'clock, I'm going for a half an hour run. Or every noon, I'm going to go swimming. Or every night, I'm going to get in the exercise bike. That's much more likely to take place. So what is marriage? Well, if someone is taking a vow to love another person, it is an ongoing opportunity to find happiness through love. Not love in general, which we never have, but love through love of this woman, Jennifer, for these kids. Right? Love of this husband, these kids. Right? It's very concrete, very specific, and that means it's much more likely to actually happen than just kind of vague ideas of love that can end up just never happening and being so unconcrete that, again, like the resolution about exercising. If you don't have a plan, you don't have, I'm going to do this or that, well, likely nothing's going to happen. So I think love, and love in marriage in particular, is very humanizing, precisely because I think love is humanizing. Any other questions?